What your hand finds to do, do it. Too many times we get hung up on a position or a title. And what I tell women who come to me and say, I feel called to pastor, but no one will hire me. You don't have to be hired to be a pastor. All you need is a flock.
Hey Ruthie, I'm so excited that you're here. Thanks for your time and sharing your wisdom with me. I've been looking forward to our time together. I know that you've been traveling around so much across the States and just speaking, and you're the historian, AG historian that makes the history come alive. You know, I remember sitting in the classroom and hearing listening to the history teacher just falling asleep, but you don't do that. It's the totally opposite. So tell me about your journey as a AG historian. How did God bring you to where you're at today?
Well, it's actually an interesting story because I didn't start out this way. History is more a hobby for me. My first love is expository preaching. And when I was pastoring, I pastored a church with a lot of readers. And the Dan Brown book Da Vinci Code came out. And I had some people in the church come to me and said, you know, this is pretty disturbing. And I had always felt that if the people in our churches had a good understanding of biblical theology and biblical teaching, that they'd be able to have something that protected them from some of these onslaughts. But what happened with the Dan Brown books is that he didn't really challenge our theology so much as he kind of back-ended around that and challenged our history. And so I sat down and read the book, and I realized anybody with a really rudimentary understanding of church history would know this is not accurate. And that made me realize that the majority of the people in our churches don't have a good understanding of church history. And so I became a lot more intentional as a pastor in using historical stories to illustrate biblical passages. And in doing that, that led to a video blog on devotions, and then that led to a daily radio program in the Omaha market on historical things in church history, which eventually, through a long round of events, led to being in the Assemblies of God archives.
Wow.
And so now what I do is I travel and address historical issues within our churches, and I find that people are hungry to learn the background of how things developed. We don't really understand who we are until we understand where we came from. And if we can do that in a way that people go, now I understand, then that does an awful lot. You know, I think there's really a biblical imperative for this. We see it in the Old Testament specifically when God told Joshua to set up memorials around the Promised Land so that when people came by them, their children would say, "What are these stones?" And then you would tell them the stories of what God had done. Now, unfortunately, the children of Israel didn't follow that, because we see in Judges chapter 2, we come up with this verse that says, there arose another generation. Two things about them: they didn't know God, nor the works that he had done for Israel. So at some point, the older Israelites had stopped telling the stories of what God had done. In the Assemblies of God and the Pentecostal movement, we just can't afford to raise a generation that doesn't know who we are, where we came from, because that determines much of where we're going.
That is so true. I really appreciate that we need to understand where we came from so that we understand where we're going. But with that, I know 25% of the AG credential ministers are women, and I do want to kind of look back where we came from. Was it always like was there always women like this? And this percentage of 25%. Is it unusual, historically unusual, and what are some of your observations as a historian?
Well, the Pentecostal movement is historically unusual in this. Historically, revival movements have always been marked by a return to lay preachers, women preachers. You could just trace that throughout history. If you look at the First Great Awakening, if we just think in an American context, up until the First Great Awakening, so much of church membership, being part of the church, was based on an intellectual assent. Well, women were not educated, and so they usually just joined along with their family. When it came to that First Great Awakening, a difference came into the religious movement there in New England in the idea that there was a personal experience of conversion. And now, in order to be a church member, you had to be able to give a testimony of your experience with God. Well, in some churches, men gave the testimonies for the women, but the women were expected to have their own experience. Second Great Awakening, we see the same kind of thing. Second Great Awakening really did bring a more egalitarian approach to church ministry in that it was so much a pioneer movement. It was very portable, going across the plains. People who were available, those wonderful Methodist circuit riders, there were female circuit riders. John Wesley used women speakers. And so we see this anytime we've got a revivalist movement. Now, the Assemblies of God and the Pentecostal movement in general came out of the holiness movement, the deeper life movement in the late 1800s. And there we see some wonderful examples of not just women ministers, but men who purposely equipped and opened up doors, prominent men. If you look at men like A.B. Simpson, the founder of the Christian Missionary Alliance, this was a time when Bible institutes were becoming very prominent in that before you went to seminary, if you're going to be a Presbyterian minister, a Lutheran minister, an Episcopalian minister, you had to have all this education. Well, those weren't open to women. But in this holiness movement, there was an emphasis on Bible institutes. Well, these were open to women, and women flocked to them. So A.B. Simpson, A.J. Gordon, Gordon College up in the Boston area, Moody Bible Institute. Many people don't realize that Moody Bible Institute in its early days was extremely open to women. If you go back and read their alumni newsletters, you find their female graduates pastoring, evangelizing, going on the mission field. It was just an incredible movement. Now, the Pentecostal movement is what we call a restorationist movement, and that is that it sees itself and its place in history as going back to the early church. And so they go back to these early Pentecostals went back to this very first church history book, which is the book of Acts, and look to see what did God do at the beginning. And if we are now at a time that God is restoring his church, what did that church look like? Well, if you look at, say, Martin Luther's concept of the priesthood of believers, where he brought in this understanding that every believer has access to God. The Pentecostals really kind of radicalized that, going beyond the priesthood of believers to a prophethood of believers. And that not only did every believer have access to God, but God had access to every believer. And so then whoever God anointed was who he would use. And we have to remember that these early Pentecostals had a worldview, that they viewed the church and the ministry through the lens very much of Joel chapter 2 as reiterated by Peter on the day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2. In the last days I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. On your male and maid servants, I'll pour out my spirit. Your old men, your young men. And so what we see there in that passage that these Pentecostals really grabbed onto was that, because we see in that passage, men and women, we see that your social status doesn't matter because we've got maidservants there, and your age doesn't matter. We've got old men, young men, and so this concept of the priesthood of believers and the prophethood of believers, it didn't matter your age, your gender, your race, your education, your social status. What mattered, what qualified you for ministry was the anointing of the Holy Spirit. And so in those beginning days, it was very much an understanding of your qualification meant that you were anointed. If you had the gift to do it, then the doors began to open for you. So what we see is that women in the early Pentecostal movement did play a very prominent part. Now, as to you mentioned numbers of credentials. The Assemblies of God has always ordained women since its inception in 1914. Now, one thing that we often don't realize is that ordination in the Assemblies of God then was different than it is now. Now we have a tiered system where you have a certified minister and then licensed and then ordained. We didn't have that at the beginning. Everybody was ordained, but you were ordained to certain ministries. So you were ordained as an evangelist, ordained as a missionary, or ordained as a pastor. So we did ordain women from the beginning as evangelists and missionaries. but not as pastors. Now that doesn't mean that the women weren't doing it, and it doesn't mean that they didn't have the support to do it. They did. It wasn't official. And so we see in the Assemblies of God in those early years, we see a development of understanding. There in 1919 at the General Council was the first time that it was decided that women could engage from the floor. Those first 5 years, they did not speak from the floor. If they had something to say, they would say it to a man and he would speak for them. 1919, it was decided they had the right to engage. In 1920, they received the full right to vote on the General Council floor. It's interesting being 1920 because that's the same year as the 19th Amendment when women received suffrage in the United States. Matter of fact, Amy Semple McPherson spoke at the General Council before she could vote. And that was the issue, and still in many ways is the issue. A woman's gift prophetically made room for her to speak, but it's that concept of leadership and decision making that has always been a little bit of a tension for us, and we see that from the very beginning. It was not until 1935 that women received full freedom for any office within the Assemblies of God, from teaching Sunday school up to general superintendent. That was in 1935. Since then, in those intervening years, we saw really a decrease in women ministers. Between World War I and World War II, there were a lot of things going historically that really affected that, specifically for the Assemblies of God. After World War II, when we joined the NAE, National Association of Evangelicals, there were some things that we needed to do to be a little more accepted with the big players in the evangelical world, and that did affect our numbers in women. No decisions were made that said that, but it did affect that. It was not until the 1980s that we really began to see a broader discussion on this. Matter of fact, there really was not much discussion, and part of the problem was that we did not develop a theology of women in ministry early on. It was not until the 1980s when Joseph R. Flower, our General Secretary, wrote a paper, Does God Deny Spiritual Manifestations to Women? That we had and that was an official General Council paper, but it was by one of our executives. And he addressed the biblical, and he made an apology really for women in ministry, going through the biblical passages that were often used to keep women from being in full ministry. And so that became a very important paper. And then, interesting, let's just throw this historical little thing in there because it's just a fun story. There was no official position in the Assemblies of God. And so what that meant was that, wherever you went, your pastor or your teacher, whatever they said was what happened. And so what happened was here in Springfield, Missouri at Central Bible College, we had women coming from all over the country to study at CBC. And there were differences of opinion among some of the teachers. And so several girls went to an English teacher, of all people. Her name's Joyce Wells Booz, and went to Booz and said, what does the Assemblies of God teach? And so she called the General Secretary's office and said, what would it take to get some kind of official position on this, because there's confusion? And they said, oh, we have to have a request from so many people. So here's what she did. I just love her. She put together a little sheet we have this in the archives, with a request for position paper and a little coupon at the bottom that said, if you would like to see a position paper, fill this out with your name and contact information. She made 50 copies and sent them to 50 friends. Well, about 3-4 weeks later, she gets this call from the General Secretary's office saying, are you responsible for all of these papers coming in? Because what had happened was she sent out 50, but then they made copies, sent them to their friends, and the office was inundated with all of these requests for position paper. So then a committee was formed, and they hammered out what is the official position of the Assemblies of God. And that was not until 1990 that was released. So from 1914 to 1990, before we really hammered out a position on women in the Pentecostal ministry.
Fascinating story.
Yeah.
I've learned so much. We have developed and we have come along for a while, and to do this since 1990, wow. That is very fascinating. I've learned something new today. Wow. So looking back and all these amazing female ministers as evangelists, pastors, missionaries, what are some of the characteristics that you see as a common thread of all these leaders, and what can we learn from them and those people that are wanting to become female evangelists, missionaries, and pastors? What are some of the things that really may help them succeed in their calling?
Sure. Well, as long as God has been calling, He's been calling women. We see that clean back to the Old Testament. And what the key for women, there's two words that I think are important for us, and that's navigate and negotiate. This is true for anyone with a dream and a goal, but for women in ministry, it becomes very important. We have to navigate where are we now and where do we want to go. We really need to get an understanding of what God has called us to do. And then we have to negotiate because there's going to be obstacles in that path. And so we negotiate around those obstacles. And what we see historically with women, let's just take a few that are well known and the way they dealt with some of this woman issue. For Amy Semple McPherson, she just didn't deal with it. She just was who she was, and she just stepped out and she did it and didn't address it. Kathryn Kuhlman is another one that a lot of people recognize. Kathryn took a very different approach. Her approach was that God called her to do what she was doing, but that she wasn't God's first choice. She said often, the only reason that I'm doing this is because whatever man God called, he said no, and I was obedient. And so she really stressed that. Now, she didn't behave like that. She walked right out and behaved as though God had put her for there. And there's a wonderful little interview on her television program that she does with Adele Carmichael. And Adele looks at her and says, Kathryn, you need to stop saying that. You were God's first choice. So that's how she dealt with it. There's a lesser known but fascinating a woman, B.B. Patton, who started a university, Patton University out in California. She's one of the first of the early Pentecostal women to really do a biblical study and an apologetic for it in her papers. And she did a very good job on it. For me personally, I've gone with the Amy sort of tact. I don't do a lot of apologetical, I can when I'm asked to teach on that, I do. But for me, my typical apology is my ministry. I just am who I am. I step out and do it and watch God work from that. And I believe that our gifts open up doors and make room for us. And so it's very important that we do that. One just example from when I was pastoring, we had the Gideons came to our church and asked to speak to the pastor, and the receptionist said that Pastor Ruthie was in, and they said, oh, your pastor's a woman. Okay, is there anybody else we can speak with? And she said, well, Pastor Bob is in. He was the associate. So they said, oh, we'd love to talk to Bob. So they went and talked to Bob and said, only Ruthie sets up the calendar. Of course, I'm listening from my office. My door was open. So I came out and greeted them. We love the Gideons. Matter of fact, do you know about your history? And I told them how their thing was founded, which they didn't know. And so gave them some of that and said, we'd love to book you for Bible Sunday. And if you want to come, we'll have an offering for you at the end of the service. So they had to stay through the whole service. And so they came in and gave their presentation and sat through the rest of the service. Afterward, they came up to me, and here's what the gentleman said. That was not what I expected. He'd heard about women in ministry, but he'd never actually experienced one. And when he did and found that the preaching was just as biblical, I'm an expository preacher. I just open up the word and start to preach. When he saw that, then his view began to change. So here's what I encourage women, and I think historically we can see this. What your hand finds to do, do it. Too many times we get hung up on a position or a title. And what I tell women who come to me and say, I feel called to pastor, but no one will hire me. You don't have to be hired to be a pastor. All you need is a flock. Start a little Bible study. Have it in your home, that's your flock. That's who you're pastoring. So you bring them the word. When they're sick, you visit them. When they're hurting, you bind up their wounds. You walk with them through life. That's pastoring. And the scripture is very clear. If we're faithful in little things, he opens big things. Look at Gladys Henson, agey young woman who wanted to go overseas and start an orphanage like her hero Lillian Trasher. But a world war interrupted that. So she looked around. Well, you know what? There's a bunch of kids in Arkansas that need help. And so she opened up a little home for them, which we now know as Hillcrest Children's Home, still going decades later, is a leading place for working with children. Compact Ministries and all of that is right there at Hot Springs, because Gladys Henson couldn't do what she wanted to do, but she looked around and put her hand to whatever was in front of her. We have so many stories like that in our history, and it's my job to work hard to get them out.
I am so inspired by all of those stories, and I'm even more inspired that young women and women now that are called to ministry today, we can be part of that, making more history, be part of God's history.
Yes.
So thankful. Ruthie, thank you so much for your time, and I'm so inspired to live differently and carry on this legacy. You do make this AG history come alive, and thank you so much for your ministry, and you're such a blessing to me and to our fellowship. So God bless you. Thank you so much, and I love you.
Love you too, Saeed.